Hey, what's up everyone? I hope that you are all doing well this week. I'm here to answer a couple of questions that came out of last Sunday's message from Ruth chapter 3, which, as you know, was this very striking, very unforgettable encounter and proposal, right, between Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Bethlehem landowner. Undoubtedly, there was a couple of questions that came out about all of that and what it means for us, how we read the Bible effectively and healthily. I'm here to answer some of them, so here we go. 1. Isn't Ruth's act of presenting herself to Boaz in the middle of the night sinful? That's an intriguing question because I think many of us here would like to stand in the position where we evaluate the characters in the Bible, whether they were good or bad, whether they're wearing the good hat that belongs to God or the bad hat that belongs to not God, and so on. And when we come to Ruth's encounter, what we find here is an extraordinarily ambiguous and intensely questionable situation, right? No doubt that Naomi had encouraged Ruth, her daughter-in-law, to go and present herself to Boaz in this very revealing manner. No doubt that the strategy, like I was saying on Sunday, was very well thought out, that she was to time this perfectly, right? After Boaz has had a bit to drink, the threshing room floor, this place was not a place for single young ladies, and obviously she was to make herself up and to become really attractive. So was all this seduction, or what seemingly appears like a very seductive maneuver, was it sinful? And I have to say that the story of this encounter, even though it was initiated by Naomi, if you notice carefully, Ruth didn't quite follow along the script that Naomi had in mind. Whatever else that you might think about Naomi's intentions and motivations, it appears that there's something surprising that happens. I didn't really make too big of a point of it, but look at verse 9 again, right? Just when Naomi had at this point would have instructed Ruth to stay put, wait, and let Boaz explain to her what was going on, Ruth actually takes the initiative. She actually says, "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied. "Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer." Now, this remark, this initiative in the middle of the night on the threshing room floor would have been remarkable to say the least. All right. First of all, Ruth was not in a position to make these kinds of gratuitous and forthright kind of tones, right, which you can clearly see that she's having here. And just before that, right, she had uncovered his feet and laid down, right? Now, uncovering his feet is an extraordinarily risky thing to do. It would have been an invitation for a carousal or something even more intimate than that. But it would appear that Ruth knew all the customs of what a proposal would look like, especially what intimacy would have looked like for a Jewish man at the time. And that's what she does. But when she says, "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied, "take me under your wing," that remark is just loaded with confidence. And it's loaded with ambiguity. The confidence is clear, right? She is clearly asking for a proposal here. But the ambiguity is also just as clear. That is the ambiguity about what "take me" means, right? Does it mean take me as your wife? Does it mean take me here and now? The language of it is more ambiguous than we might think. It's almost like when you say in English, "take me." Well, what does that mean? What does it mean, am I wanting an intimate encounter with you right now? Or does it mean something more than that? What Ruth is saying here is so fraught with ambiguity that was what I was trying to lift up from Sunday. No doubt Naomi's motivations may have been for Ruth, right, her daughter-in-law, and her finding a partner, but this whole business about expressing herself to Boaz is just filled with very forthright courage. And so I wouldn't say that what Ruth was doing here was sinful, and even to use categories of sin would be almost irrelevant when you remember that Ruth was a Moabite. She didn't belong to God's people. She certainly didn't know or was obligated to keep to the laws that God had for God's own people at the time. But what we have here is a display of extraordinary confidence and courage in a God that she didn't intimately know, that wasn't bonded to her, and yet she had plucked up this sort of faithfulness, I guess, and kindness. And we're going to move on to that for the next question, but that's what we see here very clearly from Ruth. So I would say that she diverges from the original plan of Naomi, and that is saying something, and I think that's something that will be rewarded as we see in the very next scene. And that actually leads me to the very next question, because someone else had also asked this. Can you explain chapter 3 verse 10? I couldn't figure out what Boaz meant when he said, you have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. Okay, now that's a really great question. I didn't go into it in detail, but in chapter 3, verse 10, Boaz replies to Ruth, and instead of shunning her, instead of discarding her in the middle of the night, Boaz actually welcomes it. He receives it, not in a scandalous way, but in a way that extends the protection and the covenant faithfulness of God. Look at verse 10 with me. He said, may the Lord bless you, my daughter. Okay, that shows the age gap and the also the power difference, right? You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now, what does that mean? Well, we may be helped here when we see that the word kindness in verse 10 is the word chesed, which is a word of covenant faithfulness. It is the word that is used thoroughly in the Old Testament to describe the unceasing and undeserved kindness of God himself. And that's the word that God uses about his own character, right? We see that in Exodus 34 and in other places. But here Boaz is using that word to describe Ruth's character. You have shown more kindness now than before. Well, then you ask, well, what's before? What is the previous instance of kindness that Ruth has shown? Well, we can only go by the clues that we have already read in the story. Remember, when we read the Bible, the context informs everything. Where would have Boaz known of anything else about Ruth up to this point? Well, over in chapter 2 and in verse 11 of chapter 2, Boaz reminds and tells Ruth what he knows about her and how he knew that Ruth came from a foreign land of Moab, that instead of staying in the comforts and privileges of her country in a foreign land that is back in Moab, she instead goes to a foreign land, a completely different land that's not her people, just because of her loyalty to Naomi and therefore to Naomi's God. Okay, like you remember that's what we saw back in chapter 1, right? Where you die, I will die, there I will be buried, and so on. You see? Now that's the kindness, I think, that Boaz was first referring to, right? He's saying that this act now that she is expressing and proposing, this marriage proposal, is greater kindness now than even the one that she showed back then, right? Kindness to Naomi, kindness in going with her to this foreign place. Well, how is this kindness on this threshing room floor, this proposal, greater than the one that he knew of her back then, right? When she decided to follow Naomi to Bethlehem. Well, we are informed by the next verse that says that. You see, look at same in verse 10, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Right, now what Boaz is basically saying here is that, look, Ruth could have chosen other men. He could have chosen other men because of their status, because of their privilege, because of their whoever. She could have chosen a very charming man, but she didn't. She in fact chose Boaz here, and Boaz saw that in Ruth's intention here to invite and ask Boaz to cover her and to ask him to redeem her. And he's seeing that Ruth is so loyal to Naomi and wanting to continue on Naomi's family that she would rather do this in order to forward on Naomi's name and her descendants, rather than going to choose what she would want for herself. And that is extraordinary kindness. That is great kindness. That's even greater kindness than in leaving Moab to go to Bethlehem. Okay? And so I think that chapter 3 verse 10 is an incredible compliment, it's an incredible commendation of of Ruth's covenant loyalty and her faithfulness. It's the kind of faithfulness that reminds Boaz of God's faithfulness himself, and which is why the word kindness there is used. And so this does come down to a little bit of language, right? When we come to understand that the words like kindness there has to do with God's faithfulness, there we are better helped by the story as well as the reasons that are given in the verse itself. I hope that answers the question. Lastly, when we'll close with this, here's another. And we'll end here. How should we approach different interpretations of the Bible in a healthy way, especially when examining whether certain characters in the Bible are acting in a godly or wise manner? And there's a side note here that that in the commentary that was read about chapter 3, it kind of suggests that Naomi's actions in setting up the marriage was a godly one, whereas others had a more sinister view on the approach and so on. How should we approach those different viewpoints, I guess, of the Bible in these characters? How do we know that we're doing it in a healthy way? Yeah, that's a great question, because when we read the characters of the Bible, like I said at the start, many of us would want to feel that we can judge them for their moral quality or their immoral quality, and that's kind of the end of it. You know, that is like, this king was a good king, therefore be good. This was a bad king, therefore don't be bad. And therefore we think that it's all clear cut like that. And, you know, there's got to be one way of seeing someone's motivations, and then the others are kind of wrong. What's the healthy way to go about it? Well, there are a couple of pointers that I can share that has been helpful for me when I look at a story or a character, especially in the Old Testament, and that is to look at the character in the context of the book. Find out how the flow of their actions go throughout. Find out their motivations. I mean, it's meant to be read that way because a lot of the Old Testament is narrative. It's story. It contains plot and characters and different drivers and motivations for it. And so clearly there may be some characters that are driven by evil, and therefore you pretty much know that they're evil. But there are some characters who actually have shown integrity and loyalty and kindness, and that's clear as well. But where it's not clear, where it is ambiguous, I think sometimes ambiguity could well be the point. It invites discussion, it invites rigorous debate, but at the end of the day, there can be a certain speculation about all this, and I think that can be a healthy thing. But over all this, I would also say that that's also not the most important thing as well when coming to look at a character in the Old Testament in particular, because what these characters tell you is that sometimes even the things that people do for sinful reasons, God is still using it, that foolishness to bring about his purposes, even if he doesn't commend those practices or that person. So for example, a polygamy is something that we find in the Old Testament all the time. And then you look at the descriptions of polygamy, people with multiple wives, right? I mean, we see that in characters in Genesis, right? Abraham had a couple of wives and so on. We meant to look at that and go, yeah, well, you know, the Bible actually endorses polygamy. Well, if you read the Old Testament responsibly throughout, no one with multiple wives actually ends up having a great time at all. Okay, just ask Solomon, and even ask Jacob, right, who had both Rachel and Leah. In other words, there's problems that come up when people do not live according to God's design and ways. And so there's an overall context where things do happen that are quite imperfect and very foolish and even sinful. And without endorsing any of that, God's purposes are still prevailing. And I would actually like to leave with this. There's actually an overarching story here, because every sequence and story in the Old Testament is a story of redemption that leads to a culmination. Okay? That is, after the creation and after the fall, God is at work in bringing forth a redeemer who would rescue the human race, who would reclaim the creation for himself. And the story of the Bible is the story of very much failed heroes who actually help him accomplish that. See, God can even use the weaknesses and the folly of many people that we would esteem and actually bring about his good purposes, right? Consider Moses, he was a murderer, right? Consider Abraham, he was a liar. Consider David, he was a murderer and an abuser, right? And so we have all these characters that are giants of the faith, and yet their lives are full of blemishes. Their life are full of, they're tainted by sin. It's a patchwork of good decisions and poor decisions, but the quilt is actually God's sovereign plan in bringing all things into the ultimate hero of the scriptures, and that is Jesus Christ himself. And so I think that there are some stories where you can invite debate and discussion about motivations and so on. There are some that are more accurate than the others. You let the text do the work, and that makes for a great, not just discussion, but it makes for a great community of God's people who are feeding into each other and offering different ideas. But at the end of the day, no matter which way you land, you have to know and you have to conclude that there is a story that is moving forward inexorably to the person of Jesus, who is the hero of the Bible. I hope that's helpful, and I hope that what I've given is a good guide to how I think and about how you might respond. What do you think about that? Drop a comment below or just message me. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for submitting your questions. I will talk to you later and see you guys later. Bye for now.